my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're reading from Robinson Crusoe, and we're reading his journal. September 30th, 1659. I, poor miserable Robinson Crusoe, being shipwrecked during a dreadful storm in the offing, came on shore on this dismal, unfortunate island, which I called the Island of Despair. All the rest of the ship's company were drowned, and I myself was almost dead. All the rest of that day I spent in pitying myself because of the dismal circumstances I was brought to. I had neither food, house, clothes, weapon, nor place to fly to, and in despair of any relief I saw nothing but death before me, either that I should be devoured by wild beasts, murdered by savages, or starved to death for want of food. At the approach of night I slept in a tree for fear of wild creatures, but I slept soundly, though it rained all night. October 1st. In the morning I saw, to my great surprise, that the ship had floated with the high tide, and was driven on shore again much nearer the island. This was some comfort on one hand, for seeing her stand upright and not broken to pieces, I hoped, if the wind abated, to get on board and get some food or necessaries out of her for my relief. On the other hand, it renewed my grief at the loss of my comrades, for I imagine if we had all stayed on board we might have saved the ship. At least they would not all have been drowned as they were, and had the men been saved, we might perhaps have built us a boat out of the ruins of the ship to have carried us to some other part of the world. I spent a great part of this day in perplexing myself on these things, but at length, seeing the ship almost dry, I went upon the sand as near as I could, and then swam on board. This day also it continued raining, though with no wind at all. From the 1st of October to the 24th, all these days were entirely spent in making several voyages to get all I could out of the ship, which I brought on shore every tide of flood upon rafts. There was much rain also in these days, though with some intervals of fair weather, but it seems that this was the rainy season. October 20th. I upset my raft and all the goods I had upon it, but being in shoal water, and the things being chiefly heavy, I recovered many of them when the tide was out. October 25th. It rained all night and all day, with some gusts of wind, during which time the ship broke in pieces, the wind blowing a little harder than before, and was no more to be seen except the wreck of her, and that only at low water. I spent this day in covering and securing the goods which I had saved, that the rain might not spoil them. October 26th. I walked about the shore almost all day to find out a place to fix my habitation, greatly concerned to secure myself from any attack in the night, either from wild beasts or man. Toward night I fixed upon a proper place under a rock and marked out a semicircle for my encampment, which I resolved to strengthen with a work, wall, or fortification made of double piles, lined within with cables and without with turf. From the 26th to the 30th I worked very hard in carrying all my goods to my new habitation, though some part of the time it rained exceedingly hard. The 31st in the morning I went out into the island with my gun to look for some food and discover the country, when I killed a she-goat, and her kid followed me home. The kid I afterwards killed also because it would not feed. November 1st. I set up my tent under a rock and lay there for the first night, making it as large as I could with stakes driven in to swing my hammock upon. November 2nd. I set up all my chests and boards and the pieces of timber which made my rafts, and with them formed a fence round me, a little within the place I had marked out for my fortification. November 3rd. I went out with my gun and killed 2 fowls like ducks, which were very good food. In the afternoon I went to work to make a table. November 4th. This morning I began to order my times of work, of going out with my gun, time of sleep, and time of diversion. Every morning I walked out with my gun for 2 or 3 hours, if it did not rain, then employed myself to work till about 11 o'clock, then ate what I had to live on. From 12 to 2 I lay down to sleep, the weather being excessively hot, and in the evening I worked again. The working part of this day and of the next were wholly employed in making my table, for I was yet but a very poor workman. November 5th. This day I went abroad with my gun and my dog and killed a wild cat. Her skin was pretty soft, but her flesh was good for nothing. Every creature I killed, I took off the skins and preserved them. Coming back by the seashore, I saw many sorts of sea fowls which I did not know. I was surprised and almost frightened when I saw 2 or 3 seals. While I was gazing, not well knowing what they were, they slipped into the sea and escaped me for that time. November 6th. After my morning walk, I went to work with my table again and finished it, though not to my liking, nor was it long before I learned to mend it. November 7th. Now it began to be settled fair weather. The 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and a part of the 12th, for the 11th was Sunday. I took wholly to make a chair. With much ado, I brought it to a tolerable shape, but never to please me, and even in the making, I pulled it in pieces several times. Note, I soon neglected my keeping Sundays, for omitting my mark for them on my post, I forgot which was which. November 13th. This day it rained, which refreshed me exceedingly and cooled the earth, but it was accompanied with terrible thunder and lightning, which frightened me dreadfully for fear of my powder. As soon as it was over, I resolved to separate my stock of powder into as many little parcels as possible, that it might not be in danger. November 14th, 15th, 16th. These 3 days I spent in making little square chests or boxes, which might hold about 1 pound or 2 pounds at most of powder. Putting the powder in them, I stowed it in places as secure and remote from one another as possible. On one of these 3 days I killed a large bird that was good to eat, but I know not what to call it. November 17th. This day I began to dig behind my tent into the rock to make room for my farther conveniency. Note, 3 things I wanted exceeding for this work, namely a pickaxe, a shovel, and a wheelbarrow or basket, so I stopped my work and began to consider how to supply that want and make me some tools. As for a pickaxe, I made use of the iron crowbars, which were proper enough though heavy, but the next thing was a shovel or spade. This was so absolutely necessary that indeed I could do nothing effectually without it, but what kind of one to make I knew not. November 18th. The next day, in searching the woods, I found a tree of that wood or like it, which in the Brazils they call the iron tree, for its exceeding hardness. Of this, with great labor and almost spoiling my axe, I cut a piece and brought it home with difficulty enough, for it was exceedingly heavy. The excessive hardness of the wood kept me a long while upon this tool, but I worked it effectually little by little into the form of a shovel or spade. The handle was shaped exactly like ours in England, only that the broad part had no iron shod upon it at bottom. It would not last me long, but it served well enough for the uses which I had occasion to put it to. Never was a shovel, I believe, made after that fashion, or so long a making. I was not yet satisfied, for I wanted a basket or a wheelbarrow. A basket I could not make by any means, for I had no such things as twigs that would bend to make wicker ware, or at least I had not found any. As for a wheelbarrow, I fancied that I could make all but the wheel, but that I had no notion of, neither did I know how to go about it. Besides, I had no possible way to make the iron gudgeons for the spindle or axis of the wheel to run in, so I gave it up. For carrying away the earth which I dug out of the cave, I made a thing like a hod which the laborers carry mortar in when they serve the bricklayers. This was not so difficult to me as making the shovel, and yet this and the shovel and the attempt which I made in vain to make a wheelbarrow took me no less than 4 days, always excepting my morning walk with my gun. I seldom failed to take that, and very seldom failed to bring home something to eat. November 23rd. My other work had stood still because of my making these tools, and when they were finished, I went on. Working every day as my strength and time allowed, I spent 18 days entirely in widening and deepening my cave, that it might hold my goods comfortably. Note, during all this time, I worked to make this room or cave spacious enough to accommodate me as a warehouse or magazine, a kitchen, a dining room, and a cellar. As for my lodging, I kept to the tent, except that sometimes in the wet season of the year it rained so hard that I could not keep myself dry, which caused me afterwards to cover all my place within my pail with long poles in the form of rafters, leaning against the rock, and load them with flags and large leaves of trees like a thatch. December 10th. I began now to think my cave or vault finished, when suddenly, it seems that I had made it too large, a great quantity of earth fell down from the top on one side. I was frightened, and not without reason, for if I had been under it, I should never have wanted a gravedigger. After this disaster, I had a great deal of work to do over again, for I had the loose earth to carry out, and which was of more importance, I had the ceiling to prop up, so that I might be sure no more would come down. December 11th. Today I went to work at it accordingly, and got 2 shores or posts pitched upright to the top, with 2 pieces of boards across over each post. This I finished the next day, and setting more posts up with boards, in about a week more, I had the roof secured, and the posts, standing in rows, served me for partitions to divide off my house. December 17th. From this day to the 20th, I placed shelves and knocked up nails on the posts to hang everything up that could be hung up, and now I began to be in some order within doors. December 20th. Now I carried everything into the cave and began to furnish my house, and set up some pieces of boards like a dresser to put my food upon. Also, I made another table. December 24th. Much rain all night and all day, no stirring out. December 25th. Rain all day. December 26th. No rain, the earth much cooler than before and pleasanter. December 27th. Killed a young goat and lamed another so that I caught it and led it home on a string. When I had it home, I bound and splintered up its leg, which was broken. Note, I took such care of it that it lived, and the leg grew well and as strong as ever. But I had nursed it so long it grew tame and fed upon the little green at my door and would not go away. This was the first time that I entertained a thought of breeding some tame creatures that I might have food when my powder and shot were all spent. December 28th, 29th, 30th. Great heat and no breeze, so that there was no stirring abroad except in the evening for food. This time I spent in putting all my things in order within doors. January 1st. Very hot still, but I went abroad early and late with my gun, and lay still in the middle of the day. This evening I went farther into the valley, which lay toward the center of the island, and found there plenty of goats, though they were exceedingly shy and hard to come at. However, I resolved to bring my dog to try to hunt them down. January 2nd. Accordingly, the next day, I went out with my dog and set him upon the goats, but I was mistaken, for they all faced about upon the dog, and he knew his danger too well, for he would not go near them. January 3rd. I began my fence or wall, and since I was still afraid of being attacked by somebody, I resolved to make it very thick and strong. Note, this wall, being described before, I purposely omit what was said in the journal. It is sufficient to observe that I was no less time than from the 3rd of January to the 14th of April, working, finishing, and perfecting this wall, though it was no more than about 24 yards in length, being a half circle from one place in the rock to another place about 8 yards from it. The door of the cave was in the center behind it. All this time I worked very hard, the rains hindering me many days, nay, sometimes weeks together, but I thought I should never be perfectly secure until this wall was finished. It is scarcely credible what inexpressible labor everything was done with, especially the bringing piles out of the woods and driving them into the ground, for I made them much bigger than I needed to have done. When this wall was finished, and the outside double fence with a turf wall raised up close to it, I persuaded myself that if any people were to come on shore there, they would not see anything like a dwelling. It was very well I did so, as may be observed hereafter upon a very remarkable occasion. During this time, I made my rounds in the woods for game every day, when the rain permitted me, and made frequent discoveries in these walks of something or other to my advantage. One time, I found a kind of wild pigeon, who built not as wood pigeons in a tree, but rather as house pigeons in the holes of the rocks. Taking some young ones, I endeavored to tame them, and did so, but when they grew older, they flew away. This may have been because I did not feed them, for I had nothing to give them. However, I frequently found their nests and got their young ones, which were very good meat. And now, in the managing my household affairs, I found myself wanting in many things which I thought at first it was impossible for me to make, as indeed, in some cases, it was. For instance, I could never make a cask to be hooped. I had a small runlet or two, as I observed before, but I could never make one by copying them, though I spent many weeks about it. I could neither put in the heads or joint the staves so true to one another as to make them hold water, so I gave that up also. In the next place, I was at a great loss for a candle. As soon as it was dark, which was generally by 7 o'clock, I was obliged to go to bed. I remembered the lump of beeswax with which I made candles in my African adventure, but I had none of that now. The only remedy I had was that when I killed a goat, I saved the tallow, and with a little dish made of clay, which I baked in the sun, to which I added a wick of some oakum, I made a lamp. This gave me light, though not a clear, steady light like a candle. In the middle of all my labors, it happened that as I rummaged among my things, I found a little bag, which, as I hinted before, had been filled with grain for the feeding of poultry. What little grain had remained in the bag was all devoured by the rats, and I saw nothing in the bag but husks and dust. I wanted the bag for some other use, so I shook the husks of grain out of it on one side of my fortification under the rock. It was a little before the great rains, just now mentioned, that I threw this stuff away, taking no notice of anything, and not so much as remembering that I had thrown anything there. About a month after, or thereabouts, I saw some few stalks of something green shooting out of the ground, which I fancied might be some plant I had not seen. I was surprised and perfectly astonished when, after a little longer time, I saw about 10 or 12 ears come out, which were perfect green barley of the same kind as our English barley. It is impossible to express the astonishment and confusion of my thoughts on this occasion. I had hitherto acted upon no religious foundation at all. Indeed, I had very few notions of religion in my head, and had not entertained any sense of anything that had befallen me otherwise than as a chance, or, as we lightly say, what pleases God. I had not so much as inquired into the end of Providence in these things, or his order in governing events in the world. But after I saw barley grow there in a climate which I knew was not proper for grain, and especially when I did not know how it came there, it startled me strangely. I began to think that God had miraculously caused this grain to grow without any help of seed sown, and that it was so directed purely for my sustenance on that wild, miserable place. This touched my heart a little and brought tears out of my eyes, and I began to think myself fortunate that such a prodigy of nature should happen upon my account. This was the more strange to me because I saw near it, all along by the side of the rock, some other straggling stalks, which proved to be stalks of rice, and which I knew because I had seen it grow in Africa when I was ashore there. I not only thought these the pure productions of Providence for my support, but not doubting but that there was more in the place, I went all over that part of the island where I had been before, peeping in every corner and under every rock to see more of it, but I could not find any. At last it occurred to my thought that I had shaken a bag of grain out in that place, and then the wonder began to cease. And I must confess, my religious thankfulness to God's providence began to abate too, upon discovering that all this was nothing but what was common, though I ought to have been as thankful for so strange and unforeseen a providence as if it had been miraculous. It was really the work of Providence that 10 or 12 grains had remained unspoiled when the rats had destroyed all the rest. It was the work of Providence, too, that I had thrown it out in that particular place, where, since it was in the shade of a high rock, it sprang up immediately. If I had thrown it anywhere else at that time, it would have been burned up and destroyed. I carefully saved the grain, you may be sure, in its season, which was about the end of June, and resolved to sow it all again, hoping in time to have some quantity sufficient to supply me with bread. It was not till the 4th year, however, that I could allow myself the least particle of this grain to eat, and even them but sparingly, as I shall tell afterwards in its order. I lost all that I sowed the first season by not observing the proper time, for I sowed it just before the dry season, so that it never came up at all, at least not as it would have done. Besides this barley, there were, as I said, 20 or 30 stalks of rice, which I preserved with the same care. Their use was the same, to make me bread, or rather food, for I found ways to cook it up without baking, though I did that also after some time. But to return to my journal. I worked extremely hard these 3 or 4 months to get my wall done. The 14th of April I closed it up, contriving to go into it not by a door, but over the wall by a ladder, that there might be no sign on the outside of my dwelling. April 16th, I finished the ladder, so I went up with the ladder to the top, and then pulled it up after me and let it down in the inside. This was a complete enclosure for me. Within I had room enough, and nothing could come at me from without, unless it could first mount my wall. We'll stop there and start next time with Chapter 6, After the Earthquake. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.